Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 4.1A. I've entitled this video, Making a Living in the Colonies. This video is going to cover pages 84 to 87. Making a living in the colonies. Life in colonial America was based largely on agriculture. Most colonists farmed or made their livings from businesses related to farming, such as milling flour. Geography played an important role in the colony's economic development. Colonists learned to adapt to the climate and terrain of the region where they lived. Now we can answer question number 1. What was life in colonial America largely based on? Agriculture, farming, just trying to get food. Number 2. How did geography play an important role in the colony's economic development? Well, it played a role because the colonists had different climates. As you can see from the chart, it was obviously colder in the north, and as you get closer and closer to the equator, temperatures get warmer. So then there was also that factor, and then the terrain. Some places had more rocky soil, other places had more plentiful soil that was rich. So those are the ways that geography played an important role. Commercial New England. In New England, long winters and thin, rocky soil made large-scale farming difficult. Most farmers here practiced subsistence farming, producing enough to meet the needs of their families with little left over to sell or trade. New England farmers often depended on their children for labor. Everyone in the family worked, spinning yarn, milking cows, fencing fields, and sowing and harvesting crops. Women made cloth, garments, candles, and soaps for their families. Throughout New England were many small businesses. Nearly every town had a mill for grinding grain or sawing lumber. People used water power from streams to run the mills. Large towns attracted skilled craftspeople. Among them were blacksmiths, shoemakers, furniture makers, and gunsmiths. Shipbuilding was an important New England industry. The lumber for building ships came from the region's forests. Workers floated the lumber down rivers to shipyards in coastal towns. The northern coastal cities served as centers of the colonial shipping trade, linking the northern colonies with the southern colonies and America with other parts of the world. Fishing was also important. Some New Englanders ventured far out to sea to hunt whales for oil and whalebone. Oh, my phone continues to go off during these videos. When am I going to learn to put that on silent? Now we can answer a couple questions. Number 3. What two things made large-scale farming difficult in the New England colonies? The long winters and the rocky soil. Question 4. What is subsistence farming? Subsistence farming is when you just make enough food to barely cover your needs of your own families for food. There isn't enough food to sell or to make a profit off of. You're just growing enough food to take care of your own family's needs. Question 5. What did children have to do in New England farms? They had to work. Everyone in the family worked. Question 6. How did New Englanders use streams to help their lives? They used the streams for water power, and that water power was able to run the mills. This was way before electricity, so back then water power was one of the best sources of energy you could get. Question 7. How did New Englanders use the forest to help their lives? Well, they used the forest by cutting down the trees, and with those trees they were able to ship that lumber down to the the coastal towns, to the shipyards, where they converted that lumber into making boats, and then those ships were then used for trade and for selling. Question number 8. What two resources did the New Englanders get from the Atlantic Ocean to help their lives? Well, obviously fish is a big one, and then whales. Back then, before black gold known as oil, petroleum that we got out of the ground, before that was a thing, a lot of times whales were hunted for their oil, and that was used. The Middle Colonies. Most people in the Middle Colonies were farmers. This region enjoyed more fertile soil and a slightly milder climate than New England. Farmers here plowed and planted larger areas of land and produced bigger harvests than did New Englanders. In New York and Pennsylvania, farmers grew large quantities of wheat and other cash crops, crops that could be sold easily in markets in the colonies and overseas. Farmers sent wheat and livestock for shipment to New York City and Philadelphia, which became busy ports. By 1760, New York, with 14,000 people, and Philadelphia, with 19,000 people, were two of the largest cities in the American colonies. The middle colonies also had industries. Some were home-based crafts, such as carpentry and flower making. Others were larger businesses, lumber mills, mines, ironworks, small-scale manufacturing, and so on. The middle colonies attracted many Scotch-Irish, German, Dutch, and Swedish settlers. Using agricultural methods developed in Europe, they became successful farmers. They gave the middle colonies a cultural diversity or variety not found in New England. And now we can answer a couple more questions. Question number 9. What were 2 reasons why farms were more successful in the middle colonies than they were in the New England colonies? Well, the 2 reasons are the soil was much more fertile, less rocky, more fertile, and 2, the climate there was better. It wasn't like the South, but it was much better than in the New England colonies. Question number 10. What are cash crops? Cash crops are crops that are grown to be sold to make a profit. This isn't subsistence farming where you're just growing enough. This is where you're growing a plentiful, bountiful harvest. You've got more than you need to feed your family, and then you can take that excess and sell that for profit. Question 11. By 1760, what were 2 of the largest cities in the American colonies? New York City and Philadelphia. Question 12. The middle colonies had more diversity than the New England colonies. What does diversity mean? Diversity means variety. In the New England colonies, where they were much more strict about their religion, in the middle colonies, many more cultures came over to that part. So you had people from all over Europe coming to there, and thus more diversity. So more ways of looking at things, more ways of thinking about things, and a greater acceptance of people who are different than you. Life in the southern colonies. Most settlers in the southern colonies made their living from farming because of the rich soil and warm climate. Southern farmers could plant large areas and produce harvest of cash crops such as tobacco or rice. Little commerce or industry developed there. For the most part, London merchants, rather than local merchants from the colonies, managed southern trade. So basically what they're saying there is not a lot of things were being produced that weren't related to agriculture, and that's going to come back to bite the South when we fight in the Civil War. Most large plantations were located in the Tidewater, a region of flat, low-lying plains along the seacoast. Planters built their plantations on rivers so they could ship their crops to market by boat. A plantation was like a small village. It had fields stretching out across a cluster of buildings, including cabins, barns, and stables, as well as carpenter and blacksmith shops, storerooms, and kitchens. A large plantation might have its own chapel and school. Small plantations often had fewer than 50 enslaved workers. Large ones typically had 200 or more. So now we can answer question 13. How did most settlers in the southern colonies make a living? Through farming. Question 14. Where were most of the large plantations located in the southern colonies? They were located in the Tidewater, and that is that region of flat, low-lying plains along the seacoast. So when you think about the large plantations, you think about areas here by the coast. That's where a lot of the big plantations would be found. Question 15. Describe what a typical plantation might look like during that time period. Well, it's going to look like a small town to a lot of people visiting for the first time. You're going to see a lot of buildings where people stayed. You're going to see shops like carpenters and blacksmiths. You're going to see storerooms and kitchens. They might even have their own chapel or school. So it's almost going to feel like its own little small town in itself. And of course, you're also going to see enslaved workers. Small plantations might have fewer than 50. The large ones could have more than 200. That's what you would see in a typical plantation. And of course, the crops that are being grown there, whether that be tobacco or rice, indigo, cotton, later on, that as well. Between the Tidewater and the Appalachian Mountains lay a region of hills and forests known as the Backcountry. Its settlers included hardy newcomers to the colonies. They grew corn and tobacco on small family farms. Some had 1 or 2 enslaved Africans to help with the work. Backcountry farmers greatly outnumbered large plantation owners. Still, the plantation owners were wealthier and more powerful. They controlled the economic and political life of the region. So when you think about the region they're talking about, the backcountry, many stories have been written about this and many scary movies about the hillbillies, if you will. How did they get the name hillbillies? Well, think about it. They're in the hills, and a lot of them were called William or Bill, so it very easily became hillbillies. So when you think about the backcountry, that's what you're thinking of. These people that were very self-reliant. They did not like power. They were very opposed to people who thought they were better than them. And that's going to be a tradition that even people in that region would have still today. Question number, let's see where we at here. We are at number 16. What were three differences between the backcountry farmers and the plantation owners? Well, we can go over several of these. Number one, they grew crops on smaller farms, so they didn't have the large plantations. So their farming areas were smaller. Secondly, they didn't have as many enslaved Africans. Third, they were less wealthy, and in some cases, even poor to some degree. And they did not have the kind of political power that the people that were plantation owners had. Tobacco and rice. Tobacco was the principal cash crop in Maryland and Virginia. Growing tobacco and preparing it for sale required a lot of labor. At first, planters used indentured servants to work in the fields. These servants worked for a time and then went free. When indentured servants became scarce and expensive, Southern planters began using enslaved Africans instead. Slaveholders with large farms grew wealthy by growing tobacco. They sold most of it in Europe. Sometimes, though, there was too much tobacco on the market, more than buyers wanted. To sell the extra tobacco, planters had to lower their prices. As a result, their profits fell. Some planters switched to other crops, such as corn and wheat. Question 17. What was the main cash crop in Virginia and Maryland? Tobacco. Question 18. How did the plantation owners who grew tobacco make a lot of money during that time? Well, first of all, tobacco was selling well in Europe a lot of times. There were, like the book said, a couple times where there was more than they needed, but for the most part, tobacco growing was a very lucrative deal. And when you throw in the fact that they were using indentured servants who were working in essence for free, or using slave labor who weren't getting paid anything, you can see how these plantation owners were able to turn a profit making tobacco. The geography of South Carolina and Georgia helped make rice the main cash crop there. In low-lying areas along the coast, planters built dams to create rice fields called paddies. Planters flooded the fields when the rice was young and drained them when the rice was ready to harvest. Because most Europeans did not have experience with growing rice, many relied on the knowledge of enslaved Africans who had lived in the rice-growing regions of West Africa. Enslaved Africans often did the cultivating, processing, and packaging of the rice. Growing rice was more difficult and more dangerous than raising other crops, such as tobacco. The land for growing rice had to be reclaimed from areas that were covered in swamps. Snakes, alligators, and disease-carrying insects were a constant threat to the enslaved workers. Working in the rice paddies was very hard. Enslaved workers had to stand knee-deep in mud with no protection from the blazing sun, animals, or insects. Rice proved to be a profitable crop. Prices rose steadily as rice became popular in Europe. By the 1750s, South Carolina and Georgia had the fastest growing economies in the colonies. Question number 19. Due to the geography, what became the main cash crop in South Carolina and Georgia? Rice became the main cash crop there. 20. How did enslaved Africans help the rice production in the South? Well, because most Europeans didn't know how to grow rice and the intricacies of that, they relied on the wisdom of these enslaved Africans who had been growing rice in West Africa in their lives, and so they had the expertise that was needed to grow the rice there in the colonies. Question 21. What were some challenges and dangers faced by the enslaved workers in the rice paddies? Well, you had snakes, you had alligators, you had disease-carrying insects like mosquitoes that usually carry things like yellow fever and malaria. And of course, you also had the blazing sun, so the heat. And so all these would be factors that would be challenges and dangers for the rice workers. And question 22, how did rice production affect the colonies of South Carolina and Georgia? Well, it had a huge impact. In fact, by the 1750s, these two colonies had the fastest growing economies of the 13 colonies due to rice. Well, thank you so much for watching. Before we go, I have a meme for you. This is about farming. I tried taking some high-resolution photos of local farmland, but they all turned out really grainy. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.